everybody. Welcome to the latest episode of the Dollar Bin Bandits, the only podcast with old friends discussing old comics with the people that created them. I'm Joe Marcello, joined as always by my partners in crime, Orrin Phillips.
Hey, everybody.
And Mike Farah.
Howdy, folks.
So, in a second, you're going to hear a really interesting interview. Not that, none of them aren't interesting, but this one is particularly interesting. Why? Because we're talking to none other than Danny Fingeroth. Now, you may know him as one of the people that worked on Darkhawk, and that character has just been brought back to Marvel continuity. They had his #1 a couple of months ago. Really interesting issue. They did a retrospective. Did I say that right? Retrospective?
Sounds good.
Yeah, whatever.
Yeah, Spectre Retro.
Spectre Retro.
That's exactly right.
Too bad this isn't going to be an audio only. Anyway, so it was a really great jumping off point for anyone who's new to the character. I had not read the character in ages, and when I did, it was just a few issues here and there. So it kind of recapped where the character was, what the character was up to currently, and where the character was going. So I highly recommend that you guys check it out. And he was a real pleasure to talk to.
Yeah, Danny Fingeroth is kind of the man. When you look at all the comics he's worked on, is a writer and an editor. So much he's been a part of Spider-Man. Like when I looked at my collection, like a Marvel book, so much Danny Fingeroth editor, Danny Fingeroth writer. Really one of the better Spider-Man writers of his generation. And overall, just such a nice guy.
And a real, comics history buff as well. You guys got into one of his more recent projects, which was a Stanley Biography. Goes really into depth about, how Stanley broke in, what he did for the industry, and then, how he became a spokesperson for not only Marvel, but just comics in general. So an interesting read there, and good in-depth reporting from my fellow bandits. So again, without further ado, let's give you Danny Fingeroth.
Thank you so much.
It's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me. And yes, that is, I know the cover is confusing because it says The Amazing Life of Stan Lee in the upper part, and then it's got A Marvelous Life. But if you look at the back, if you look at the spine, A Marvelous Life, The Amazing Story of Stan Lee.
There you go.
I had to figure out some way to sneak the word Marvel in there.
It worked out pretty well.
Makes sense.
Don't tell anybody. Shh.
That'll be our secret on this.
Okay.
I wanted to start off real quick with early in your career. You get to Marvel, you've been working on a few projects, and you get the book Dazzler. How is that pitched to you? What were you told as far as keeping the story going, or did you even like the character, or is it just, okay, I got this assignment?
Wow. You kind of, this is interesting because, it's you skipped a few steps and sort of the whole narrative. Is this sort of based on, I guess, is this what the internet says
A little bit, yeah.
Okay, well, it's, the internet is famous for getting like taking dots and then connecting them in
all sorts of ways.
In all sorts of ways that I guess it leaves interpretation. I got my first job at Marvel was as an assistant editor in the British department, working for Larry Lieber, Stan Lee's brother, who was running the British department, which mostly did reprint material in England. So that was in 1977. So I worked for that department. Then the department, for various reasons that made complete sense, decided that maybe comics for sale in England should not be put together by guys from Brooklyn, the Bronx, and Queens, but maybe actual British people should put the British books together. So that office mostly went over there, but I stayed around as the liaison and as a special assistant to Jim Shooter and Sal Brodsky. I call it the Danny Fingeroth Memorial job because they really closed the department, but I guess they liked me enough to want to keep me around. And I was, my salary was small enough that I think it just would have been a rounding error in their finances. So I did that for about a year. Then when Louise Simonson, who was then Louise Jones, came over from Warren Publishing edit the X-Men and the Conan and books, and I became her assistant. And one of the comics we had in our roster of about 5,000 titles was The Dazzler. And I was the assistant editor, then I was the editor. And then through through a valuable learning experience, mainly like alienating the writer, who quit and wondering if I was going to be fired, I then became the editor of The Dazzler. I then became the writer of The Dazzler as well as the assistant editor. So yes, I strategized. I started strategizing when I was about 11, when I was reading the comics as a kid, and I figured one day there'll be a thing called disco. There's going to be a comic about it, and I'm going to engineer to have a fight with my writer, so he quits in a huff, and then I, as a consolation prize, get to take over as writer. So
that's the perfect plan.
I was a pretty smart kid, as you can see.
That's the logical plan of, logical path.
Yeah.
I mean,
and of course, it happened just the way I predicted.
Perfect.
I wish I had the foresight.
So that's how I ended up writing The Dazzler, and that was an odd assignment, although she certainly is popular enough that that the second Dazzler Masterworks volume just came out. That I wrote the introduction to both volumes. It was very near the beginning of my career. I was always wanted to write, and I'd written a lot of kind of one-page recap pages and letters pages, and I'd done a little bit of writing. Co-wrote a couple of Avengers stories. There's probably a few other things I'm forgetting, and I had a tiff with the Tom DeFalco, who later turned out to be one of my best friends in the world. But at that point, he wasn't feeling that well disposed towards me. He disagreed, and he was right about some of my editorial decisions. They would give an assistant editor a title that was, not the Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, to kind of learn while you earn. So that's why I was was acting as the editor of Dazzler, and then sort of similarly, when Tom left the book, Jim Shooter, took his sword of power and knighted me as the writer of Dazzler, which was a mixed blessing, because it's like if you get assigned to, I don't know, Iron Man or Hulk or a second string Marvel hero, or even a top tier one who's not that well known, you can kind of make your mistakes in public, because that's what you do in comics. You learn while you earn, and the entire world gets to see you screw up or do well, But the Dazzler was such a oddball character. By the time we got around to putting it out, disco was pretty much dead anyway, and yet here we were with this character whose sort of premise was the disco outfit and the disco skates. So that was a an odd character to learn to write comics with.
Oh, she made it into the X-Men movies for like a minute, but she was there. So,
and the comic was very popular. The Dazzler #1 was designed to the direct market was, the comic book shops were starting to become big, and they, I guess there were a number of retailers who basically said, make a comic that's just for us, that won't be sold on the newsstand, and we'll show you what we can do. And in that odd way the market works, Dazzler #1 sold 400,000 non-returnable copies. And the sales never reached that high again, but they did pretty well for quite a while.
Yeah, I was just saying, the covers are great. They had team ups with like Iron Fist.
Oh yeah,
Luke Cage. Had Dr. Doom in there at times, and so she mixed in with a lot of the popular characters as well.
Right. Oh yeah, no, that's part of the reason for the appeal. I think the book, we could never really decide if it was, a straight on superhero book, a romance book. It sort of went through a lot of different identity. I mean, it's funny, I think as it came out, it definitely had its fans, and every, I worked hard on that, like you work hard on everything. But when I was preparing to write the introductions to the collected editions, to the masterworks, it's an odd feeling to read something you wrote decades ago, and to read them all in one sitting, when really they were intended to be read once every month, once a month. So there's some stuff I thought was still clever, that I got to do there, but it's kind of like watching your life flash before your eyes.
Good way to describe it.
Without dying, hopefully.
And what books did you want to work on?
Well, the book, I'm from the first generation of Marvel readers, so my dream book was Fantastic Four. That would have been, I know it sort of seems to somebody, who's under 50 or whatever, FF is certain, it hasn't been always the brightest star in the Marvel firmament in recent years, and certainly the movies have gotten pretty badly panned and not that well attended. But that was Stanley and Jack Kirby at their peak. I mean, they were both doing lots of other work every month, and I guess I came to like Spider-Man more after I worked on Spider-Man professionally. But the Fantastic Four was so far and away my favorite title. I love Iron Man, I love Daredevil, but the kind of one of the things that, and maybe here's where your viewers can come in. Years ago, Al Milgram and I collaborated on a 78-page Fantastic Four graphic novel, guest starring the Vision and Scarlet Witch, and featuring Quasimodo and the Mad Thinker. I wrote and scripted the entire 78 pages. Al did the layouts on all of them. Janice Chang lettered the whole thing, or pretty much the whole thing, and Al has inked about 20 pages. Oh, wow. And I think Marvel has written it off. Every once in a while, there'll be a fan campaign to pull this thing out of mothballs and let it see print. It's like, yeah, again, the company paid for it. It's got characters that people like, so I would love to see the light of day, because I've done a few one-off Fantastic Four stories, including one that was like a backup in an issue of Marvel Fanfare that Al edited, that I think nobody ever confirmed it for me, but I think there were some story points in it that ended up in the first FF movie, which was kind of a surreal experience. Right. Yeah, far and away the Fantastic Four. As I said, my favorite now might be Spider-Man, maybe because I work so much on the character as an editor and writer, but kind of I kind of had this dream of growing up somehow to be both Stanley and Jack Kirby at the same time.
A dream to have.
So I wanted to take the opportunity to ask you about Darkhawk. Okay. I just finished reading the new issue, which I really liked. And I would love to ask you, what was your inspiration for creating Darkhawk or writing Darkhawk?
Okay, well, again, credit where credit is due. By the way, I have a Will Eisner splash page from Will Eisner's The Spirit in the background, a story called Black Alley. Darkhawk was created by Tom DeFalco and Mike Manley. Okay. The context out of which it came was just before the boom, like the super boom and glut of the early 90s. Okay. Just before that, Marvel was growing at a medium but steady pace, and the editorial plan, which seems very logical, is that we would put out a new title every month, and you figure half of them will succeed, half will fail. And so you grow the line at a very rational, logical 6 titles a year. What could be more reasonable? Well, of course, very soon after that, there was that big boom, and suddenly marching orders were to, pump out as much as we could, as fast as we could.
Yep.
But in that window of about maybe 2 years, that's what Marvel was doing, and Tom saw it as part of his job to come up with new characters. And Darkhawk was designed to be Spider-Man for the 90s. Say a Spider-Man was Spider-Man for the 60s, Nova, Spider-Man for the 70s, Speedball, Spider-Man for the 80s, then Darkhawk was Spider-Man for the 90s. I later teamed all them up in a limited series called Spider-Man: Friends and Enemies. So I was always looking for a regular series, and I was editing the Spider-Man titles then. And in those days, not only were editors allowed to write and do freelance work, we were encouraged to write and do freelance work. So I was assigned Darkhawk. So I wrote it from the very first issue, and I took Tom's 4-page outline and expanded it along with editors Greg Wright and Howard Mackey and Mel Yumtov. So I kind of put flesh on those very sturdy bones that Tom had come up with, and Manley was the artist who designed the look and feel and was very often involved in the plotting. So that was, I guess there's maybe a point of view, it's perfectly understandable, of people who are not in the industry to think that everything is a matter of, lightning bolts of inspiration and flights of unstoppable passion and just things come to you in a dream and you wake up and stuff. But sometimes it's a job.
You mean the lightning bolt of inspiration didn't just hit you and you were like, boom, this Darkhawk.
Many little after I got the assignment, many little lightning bolts did, maybe a little electric shocks, and I think I added and fleshed out, things that were not in the outline and that I'm proud of, and some various twists on sort of comic book tropes, and so I'm proud of the book and what we did on it, and but it exists. That's comic books are the very definition of commercial art. You take this inspiration, but you also have a deadline and the need to make a living and to generate income and intellectual property for a big corporation, and you mix it all together. And if you're lucky, you get something that you have pride in and are not embarrassed to look at 20 years later. I think so. I think I did it. It was good to be able to do a riff on Spider-Man, to do a teenage superhero, but who wasn't Spider-Man. Somebody who didn't have 30 years of continuity behind him, and so it was kind of a nice feeling to be able to do something. I always imagined the readership, and I thought, well, whether it's a kid or a teenager or even an adult, here's their character, here's their new thing that it's literally not your father's superhero.
So to that point, how does it feel to be writing Darkhawk now with all that continuity behind it? And the character it's older now. I mean, that the latest issue, I really liked it because it seemed like, it was, it's a great jumping off point for new readers. It very subtly kind of recaps the high kind of, this is what the character is and this is where we're going, quite literally into the future. At the last page where the gem kind of flies off, which I really like that story, the way that was structured with like the 3 separate kind of eras. But now, that the character has some baggage. How does it feel to write that character now?
That's none of my business.
Okay.
I mean, I'm not. I haven't read. Yeah, I mean, I can't say I haven't seen, but I haven't read any Darkhawk that I haven't written.
Okay.
So, not really that concerned. I feel
Okay.
good about the character.
Okay.
If you know, if Marvel wants me to write him again, here I am to write him again. But most writers don't. Most writers who identify with the series make it their business not to read what anybody else has done afterwards, because it's just too weird. No matter how good the people are, and you know, there are good people who worked on it. It's not our character. It's not our story, and we're not getting paid. So
Fair enough.
So the way that, you know, and I was, but you know, I have a very, you know, I was glad to do it. I have a good relationship with Marvel and the people there, and Mike Manley and I were actually talking about doing something for the character's 30th anniversary. Hey, let's pitch something. And I think at the same time, Marvel was thinking, oh, you know, we're gonna, you know, I think there were people in the editorial hierarchy who loved Darkhawk and who remembered it from when it came out. So, you know, just this odd coincidence, and I actually could not tell you which came first. Mike and I were talking about pitching a story, but they also asked us to do a story, and I swear to you, I can't remember which came first, but we sort of had the beginnings of a story, and we figured if they were to want me and Mike, then and this indeed was true, they'd want it to be something that took place within the continuity that we'd established. So, you know, for those who are, you know, I put, you know, we planned the story so that it takes place between issues 8 and 9, if you're keeping score, of the original series, of which I wrote all 50 issues, and Mike drew the first 25, and he did at least the first annual. I wrote all the annuals, except for a couple of backups. And so what I tried to do was write a story that was satisfying both for people who had read it before, as well as satisfying for people who hadn't read it before. So it kind of harkened back to Darkhawk's. I only do characters that start with DA because my name.
It's easy.
My name starts with DA, you know. So it Dazzler, Darkhawk, Danny. So that's, I think we succeeded at that, but and also I wanted to still find a way to put in a little kind of, you know, moment with a surprise for old time readers. So I think I managed to get all that in there and still fit it into 15 pages, and still put in, not really a spoiler alert, but you know, but I did manage to put in a Dazzler reference, which if you've read it, you know, I did that. So I was happy to do it, and I'd love to do more. But sort of my assignment for this, and the, you know, the thing that they wanted from me and Mike was a story set in the original continuity.
Excellent.
Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about this book here, because I got to tell you, I really enjoyed it. You could tell reading the book that you genuinely cared for Stanley, but at the same time, you wrote this book right down the middle. It's not, you know, pro or con anyone. It's very as it happened. You know, you show both sides of things, and there's a part in it that really stuck.
I appreciate that, because I really tried hard to do that.
Oh, definitely. And one thing you wrote that stood out when I'm reading it, I had to stop and think, was you talked about Stanley's voice and how it gets sort of in your head. So when you're reading certain stuff of his or certain comic books, you hear Stan Lee, you know, while you're reading it. And I just was like, he's so right on the money with that. Because, you know, when I'm reading like, you know, older books and, you know, he's putting the intro with it or something like that, I'm like, yeah, I just hear his voice when I'm doing these things.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was awesome.
Thank you. Well, you know, it's, you know, Stan, it's so hard to separate him from Marvel, because obviously he it was a chicken and egg thing. Well, of course, Marvel existed since as a comic book company. It existed as a pulp company since the early 30s.
Right.
It existed as a comic book company since 39. And Stan started working there in 1940 as a teenager. So, and then, his career rose and fell with Marvel, although he did lots of other stuff outside the company. But yeah, I did a couple of lengthy interviews with him about a year before he died for the book. It's not an authorized book, but he did cooperate, and do interviews. And he was agnostic about telling people whether to talk to you. So I'm not going to tell people to talk to you or not to talk to you. It's up to them. Because I did about 50 interviews for the book, but 2 lengthy interviews with him. Plus, I had interviews I'd done with him in the past that I only used excerpts from. So I asked him, I said, how did you figure out that making your personality and voice synonymous with Marvel's personality and voice, how did you figure that out to do that? I guess nobody knows if he couldn't have known that it would work or not. How'd you figure out to do that? And he really, although he always spoke of Marvel as kind of like an advertising campaign and building the brand and make mine Marvel and it's the Marvel Age of Comics, he claimed, and I have no reason not to believe him, that he didn't consciously try to make himself the voice and face. It just sort of, look, I'm sure at a certain point he figured out what was going on and decided to amp it up. But to me, that was as a kid. And again, if you look at the history of Marvel, say in the era that I came in, a lot of other people did too, all born within a year or 2 of me in either direction. So those of us who had that Marvel spell cast on us, and I have to be honest, you say Stan's voice, and probably since you're a bit younger than me, you probably heard the voice and then maybe saw the comics or maybe some. Right. When I first heard Stan Lee on the radio, it was disappointing only because nobody could match up to that voice that was my pal and storyteller in the comics. It was a very, it was sort of like what I say about Spider-Man. I liked Spider-Man as a kid, but the FF was by far my favorite. It took me actually working on Spider-Man professionally to really appreciate that character. And in a way, it sort of took me being in the business and working for and with Stan to appreciate, the actual person as opposed to this incredible fictional, leader of the Merry Marvel bullpen that would tell me these inside stories about comics every week in the comics.
What was it like though to see, as you said, there's the image and you got to know the man. What's that like for you personally to be able to say, listen, I actually knew Stan Lee. Like I had conversations with him that were more than just, what you would see on the sound bites and stuff like that.
Right. Although I do, for various reasons, but I knew Stan, I was friendly with him, but I would never say that I was in his inner circle of friends. I mean, I was a colleague that he eventually did find. Well, I had these very odd, because I worked with him in various ways, from day one, although I actually worked with him more after I left Marvel than when I was there. But he's a guy I knew, obviously, and worked with him. But then I was a guy who also would call him on the phone or email him, at Marvel, and then when I worked for Byron Price, when I worked for Visionary Media, when I worked with Tomorrow's, when I worked at, just freelance as a consultant. I mean, I actually, I'll tell you, I had some interaction with him, for that Marvel exhibition, but that's jumping ahead of the story. So I guess I came in with a less idealized version of him than I think a lot of people came in with. I was also a native New Yorker. I was kind of a little bit jaded. I'd seen it all. I was, I had a somewhat dim view of human nature. So that Stan was at all good and generous and courageous and positive, I found pleasantly shocking. So as opposed to a lot of people, I think, who went, ooh, Stan did a human thing. Stan let somebody down, or Stan wasn't completely honest. I was always just shocked the opposite. Oh my God, Stan is not like this. Stan is not the ideal image of the fantasy guy in the bullpen bulletins, but he is a pretty good guy, albeit one who's highly flawed, you know. But I think, and I think that's almost the difference. When I see people writing about him or even reviewing my book or other books that have come out, you can almost see it. Stanley is kind of almost a litmus test for your attitude about life in general. I didn't mean to get all deep on you there.
No.
So it was interesting to see, like I said, to see where he went above and beyond what he had to do for people. Maybe one of the great stories. I was in LA on business in the 90s. I was supervising the shooting of the holodiscs.
Okay.
There were anniversary issues of Spectacular and Amazing Spider-Man. The reason you don't remember him is because it was a terrible gimmick. Here's the thing: if you had like a pen light flashlight of a certain kind, and you shined it on these holodiscs and spun them around slowly, it was great, actually. But it depended on a reader or a consumer having that, or the store putting just the right kind of spotlight. It's one of those things that a salesman came in, I guess, and said, "Look at this, isn't it cool?" And somebody in Marvel went, "Oh, that's cool." Anyway, but it needed a special. I had to go to I had to go to Oxnard, which is not, which is, people joke about it because it's not glamorous, but I had to go to this one studio that did this technology that had a 35 millimeter silent movie camera from the 1920s, because only the camera that old had the steady registration to make a 3D holodisc.
Wow.
I know this is probably much more information than you wanted. So I was out there doing that, and with my then girlfriend, and we were having dinner with Stan and Joan. Marvel had been going through ups and downs, and I knew I was going to be leaving soon. It was a very weird time, and I think Stan felt that he was being marginalized by the regime at Marvel at that point. I think they were sort of wondering why they were spending so much money on this guy, and so we kind of bonded over that. And it was during the floods of early '95. There were mudslides and floods. So Stan and his wife and my girlfriend and I went out to dinner, and then we went back to their house for dessert or something, and the roads back to Oxnard were flooded and there were mudslides, and so Stan and Joan said, it's too dangerous. You can't. Oxnard was like 40, 50 miles away. We need to find you a hotel near here to stay in. And so here's this kind of mixed bag memory. On the one hand, I have this great memory of Stanley on the phone calling hotels on our behalf. Like, "Oh, do you have any rooms?" "Oh, yeah." So, I mean, that was great. And then, and it was a very nice hotel. It was on expense account. So, and then he and Joan get in their car and actually lead us down the winding road from their house to the main road. So So I mean, on the one hand, I'm thinking, and this is like 90%, and I go, wow, that is like, what a memory. Stanley calling up to try to find a room, Dan and Joan really, risking their safety to drive us down. And then at one point, I did say to myself, they could have just said to us, "Why don't you stay here?"
I didn't want to say anything, but yeah. Stay here, true believer.
Now it might have been, of course, I guess a lot of the meal we had before that was spent with Joan, especially telling us how she didn't approve of people living together without being married. So maybe when
living
in
in
sin,
sin, yeah.
to that,
Aren't there extenuating circumstances like inclement weather? I mean, come on.
And they could have had us and said, but I mean, look, I get it. I mean, maybe I can certainly understand somebody I was having dinner with suddenly can't go home.
Sure.
And I really want them in my. No, I mean, so yes, it was really, really nice, but it's sort of, There's that little lingering thing, like, well, would have been, I mean, so I guess Stan was complicated like that. So I think, like I am, like we all are, So I mean, who knows what motives and what was going through his head, but certainly in my mind is that great image of Stanley on, because certainly Stan did not say, this is the days before cell phone. So Stan did not say, here's the phone, here's the yellow pages, good luck. He actually got on the phone and was, I mean, he probably had a touch tone at that phone. I shouldn't go like that. So I mean, I think that almost defines Stan in a way. He did a lot of great things for people, but maybe there were times when he could have gone even an extra mile that probably most of us wouldn't, but because he was Stanley, people thought he should have.
Right.
And to kind of strip the metaphor away, it's like, what was his responsibility to Jack Kirby, and what power did Stan really have? Because he was the voice and face, but he was not the owner. He was never the owner of Marvel in any way, shape, or form. He never had the last word. So, so should he have said, if you don't do right by Jack Kirby, I'm quitting? Well, maybe, but how many of us would have? I mean, that's, it was that, many things in his life were complicated, which is why he was a great guy to write a book about.
Yeah, I was going to say. I just want to get your opinion because it's something you just mentioned with Kirby and stuff. Being in the industry as you have, can you see how relationships like theirs got so strained over things like that?
What is yeet?
Why is yeet?
Gentlemen, look it up in the dictionary. Yeet is the greatest comic book anthology, independent comic book anthology on the market.
Yeet actually is defined as to hurl or move an object forcefully, or as an exclamation of enthusiasm.
And that's what the comic is. On a month-to-month basis, you get enthusiasm, you get forward motion, you get all the good stuff that the dictionary says you should get from Yeet Presents. Give them some of the artists that are coming up, Oren, or have been in Yeet.
We have great artists like Eric Luna Salazar. We've had Tom Wojciechowski do the lettering. We've had Mike Barron doing a story. We've had a lot of great people. Friends of mine, Dennis Miller, Jason Mink, Mike Jones. The list goes on and on and on. For $5 a month, you too to be part of the Yeet Army.
And you can have it all yeeted at your face.
Look for the link in our show notes to their Patreon and get your Yeet on. $5 a month. What else are you going to do with that $5? You're just going to waste it. Give it to Yeet. Get some good stories. And yeet it up.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's look, don't forget, Stan. Look, Stan. It's odd because Stan was related to the owner.
Yeah.
Wasn't his son. Wasn't his grand. He was Martin Goodman's. He was actually related to Martin Goodman two different ways. It's very complicated. It's spelled out in my book, and you would need like a computer program to map out exactly. But he was related to Goodman. But my impression is that they were not close. Whatever their technical, actual, org chart or family chart. I don't think they were close, but Stan did come to work there. And half the people who worked for Martin Goodman were related to Martin Goodman. I mean, that was, it wasn't like Stan was some exception. Half the people there were named Goodman. It was not a big secret.
Family business.
Yeah, it was. So, but nonetheless, Stan was a relative. So although, as that sometimes gave Martin a license to treat Stan sort of extra shabby because he was related, bottom line, I think Stan was, editor, art director, head writer, and related to the owner. So I think there was which is partly why Marvel was as good as it was, because Stan could be, in effect, an auteur, and he might, and look, there were times they had people redraw stuff when they didn't pay them. I mean, there are a lot of things that were wrong with that system, but at the end of the day, it was his imprint you know, and that does, I hope I'm not taking anything away from Kirby or Ditko, because without those guys, Stan could have all the imprint he wanted, but he's got nothing. So the combination of them, and even Martin Goodman, who had with a certain overarching influence that is hard to really gauge. But if you read Goodman's other publications, which I did, again, in Michael Vasallo, you may know as Doc B, has this incredible collection of Goodman publications from over the decades, not that are not Marvel comics, and you can sort of see the context the comics came out in. So yeah, so it was guaranteed, and there'd really been a falling out with Timely Comics, as it was called, in the 40s, and Simon and Kirby over royalties for Captain America. So coming back there with the last place Jack Kirby wanted to go, but he burned a bunch of other bridges. And Marvel had, although Marvel had been an enormous company in the 40s and 50s, and 57 it had a big implosion for a number of reasons. So then they became that mythical little engine that could, and only 8 monthly title, the 16 by. Yeah, so there was a power imbalance. And then there's just the whole problem of the work for hire tradition, or whatever you want to call it in comics, where the company owns everything, and Stan was abused by that system as much as anybody. I mean, I can't say this enough, because people, it just makes sense. He's Stan Lee. Of course he owned that company and the characters, or sold them. He never did. He was always, a highly paid, obviously, and highly thought of, but he was always an employee. He was never an owner, but yeah, there was going to be inequities like that, because I think Stan always identified with Martin. I think he and Martin had ultimately had a big falling out.
Right.
But I think Martin was his role model. Stan's own father was not successful, and I think was a very difficult personality, and often unemployed or underemployed, and just kind of sitting around the house, angry, reading the want ads. So I think Martin was really the role model, and sort of what Stan in his way aspired to be. So yeah, I think Jack and Ditko and everyone, look, ultimately those guys did leave. Yep. Although oddly enough, they all ultimately came back, which indicates to me that as bad as Marvel was, the other places they landed were as bad or worse. That's not claiming, that's not that's not a great claim of virtue, but
it's the devil sometimes.
Yeah, well, I think they got to know both devils, or multiple devils. Well, you have to say Ditko ultimately, or certainly for a lot of his career, certainly stuck to his principles, and he did a lot of work for Carlton, which was famous for paying the worst rates in the business, but he had pretty much complete freedom there.
Yep. One thing that you brought up in this book that I think it's really well documented is almost Stanley's business approach of having a very folksy business approach, like saying, hey, calling himself Stan. You brought the readers in. It was sort of, there was a relationship there between Marvel and the people there and the readers. Do you think it hurt that DC decided they didn't want to follow that kind of path, that they, Stan had this thing of let's bring people in, and they sort of were like, okay, here are books, buy them?
Well, I think it was a little more complicated than that.
Oh yeah.
I think they were damned if they did and damned if they didn't, because here's what Stan, this is a really smart thing among many smart things that Stan figured out. Stan realized he couldn't pretend to be like a hip young person, right? He was almost 40 when Fantastic Four 1 came out, which years, back then when most, it was rare for people to live past 75. If you were almost 40, you were certainly half over with your life. Now we think of somebody who's like 38 as, they're just starting out. unless you're a professional athlete or something. But otherwise, you think. But I think Stan knew that he couldn't pretend to be a young person. He couldn't pretend that he was a hippie or a hipster, and he decided, and again, somewhere in him, he figured out the best person to be was a sympathetic adult, to be the aunt or uncle who understood what you loved about these comic books and what you loved about popular culture. He wasn't trying to be a 13-year-old or an 18-year-old. He wasn't trying to be Jerry Garcia. He wasn't trying, he wasn't trying to be, he understood that if he tried that, later on, I guess in the 70s and 80s, he had this weird, I think he got more into almost a Hollywood kind of thing with the open neck shirts and the gold chain. I think he knew then that wasn't appealing to kids. I think then he was almost playing to a Hollywood, I think he was sort of playing to what he thought the other players in Hollywood. But when I was 10 years old, I knew Stan Lee was an adult. I didn't really, I didn't understand all the different shades of adult aging, but I knew he was an adult. But I knew he was involved in making these comics, talking to me about them. And part of that has to do with, it's very funny, right? Marvel is owned by Disney, huge corporation. DC is owned by whatever huge corporation owns them this week, but Time Warner, which is owned by
AT&T.
AT&T, right? Although Verizon just sold off their most of their entertainment. I guess AT&T still has. But somehow Marvel still retains the ability to make decisions quickly when DC couldn't, and seems like they still can't. It's a very funny something in their company DNA. So Stan knew, okay, I'm not fooling anybody. I may write that Country Joe and the Fish came to the office, but I'm not pretending that I'm like joining the band, So because he could do that, other people didn't get that. So you had a lot of other companies where they tried to pretend that they were young and that they were really teenagers in disguise. And it kind of made them look silly. It was kind of embarrassing.
Right.
And then Stan finally did hire young people like Roy Thomas and Gary Friedrich and Denny O'Neil, who really were young people, who really did understand the youth culture. But DC, and other companies tried to sort of fake it, and it came across, to me anyway, they still sold a lot of comics, but to me it came across as sort of silly, whereas Stan was like an adult who happened to understand and make the things that I liked.
That makes a good point.
So I wanted to ask, this is little Stanley adjacent, but on the topic of Jack Kirby, is it seemed like he wasn't really properly used so much in DC. Do you have any thoughts on that? Why have him working on Jimmy Olsen? He, to start at least, it seemed like an odd place to start. Granted, he created New Gods and all that stuff that I absolutely adore and love, but good Lord, of all places.
Well, that's what you have to understand. And here I think is where Stan and Jack did mesh and where they did relate. Although there was a 5-year difference in their ages, and they're up. I think Stan was very poor. I think Jack was desperately poor. And I think Jack did seem to grow up in a tougher neighborhood, or at least was willing to interface with the tough guys in the neighborhood. Stan, until Larry was born, was an only child for 10 years. So even though they didn't have money, whatever they did have, he was kind of treated like a prince. But I think what they both came from was impoverished Depression era backgrounds. And what that meant was you didn't take anybody's job. Somebody had a job, but that was the most important thing. Mm-hmm. So I met Kirby once or twice, and I could tell you that one of them was a funny story, but I certainly didn't know him beyond meeting him those one or two brief times. But my understanding is that Kirby asked the SDC, he said, what book? I forget if he said what's your lowest seller or just what's the one that doesn't have a regular team. He wanted to, have, and I think he must have had a quota of pages that he was responsible for. He said, I'll take, aside from my 3 comics, I will take whatever book does the least harm to somebody else's income. And that was how he ended up with Jimmy Olsen, is my understanding of it.
That's pretty cool.
That's very interesting.
Yeah. So that's, or maybe it was maybe they were going to change the team anyway, but to him, it was very important that he not mess with somebody's income.
So then he was like, I'm going to create a whole new pantheon of characters. And I'm going to...
Now, why it started in Jimmy Olsen, I don't know. Mark Evanier probably knows. He's a Kirby's biographer and worked for Jack and everything, and he's the expert on all things Kirby. But
what you said makes complete sense. I didn't think about it in those terms.
Yeah. So why they kind of previewed, the Fourth World and that, and didn't just come out with the Fourth World on its own, that maybe the thought was it's a Superman family title, so, and we'll have Superman in it and that'll draw attention, but that that I couldn't answer.
There's something in your book that that you focused on a lot of different stories, and that's a guy you mentioned earlier, Larry Lieber, who I think kind of is a bit of an unsung hero in the Marvel story, because in your book you kind of show, he was a jack of all trades. If they needed him to do something, he jumped in and he did it, and he did a good job at it. And I don't think he ever got the popularity as maybe some other folks, but boy, oh boy, what a steady and sturdy member of the team through all those years.
And it's, I mean, I think I've said, I discuss him in the book. Larry hired me. Larry was the person who hired me at Marvel. And again, I didn't know him till that day I worked in for the interview. And he's a very sweet guy. It's got to be tough to be, to be Stanley's brother in the best of circumstances. It's not, you're in a position where your brother is not just in the same business and maybe he's a little more successful. Your brother is the most famous guy that ever lived in the same business you're in,
No pressure.
No pressure. How do you deal with that? And so Larry is a talented editor, writer, artist. I mean, he actually draws. Stan was not a bad cartoonist. Stan could do some good doodling. I once watched him do one on stage during a panel that I moderated with him at a convention. But Larry's a different. They have some similarities. You spend time with Larry, you can see how they're similar, but very different. Stan was obviously, Stan's alternate career, the thing he would have preferred to do. I don't prefer, but although he was quite ambivalent about being in comics too, but I think he would like to have been an actor. He would love to have been a movie star, and I guess he ended up being one. In his but Larry is more of an introvert, and Stan, had that big. He always had that big personality. People who knew him, in high school, even talk about, you'd seen his high school yearbook page. His nickname was Gabby. His ambition was to get to the top and stay there. He wanted. The Navy used to have a slogan: "Join the world and see the Navy." His slogan in his high school yearbook was, "I want to join the Navy so the world can see me." So they're just very different personalities. And Larry. Larry finally, after all these years, is getting recognized as the guy who wrote the scripts for the first issue, the first appearance of Thor, the first appearance of Iron Man, the first appearance of Ant-Man. He did a lot of work, but they had a very complicated life. I know I say that a lot, but they did. They had a very complicated relationship.
Makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think reiterating that is important, because I think a lot of people don't realize the success of what we see now was built on the blood, sweat, and tears of others, really busting their humps, whether it be through work or the relationships of others around them. I mean, case in point, what you just described to me about Jack Kirby. I mean, I hadn't thought about that in those terms. It was just like, well, here's this guy who's, from my point of view, is just a fantastic artist. Why put him with this character? And you just don't think of it that way, and it just proves that we don't realize that stuff. So
no, that's what I tried to do in my book, and and any decent biography does, I think, is try to put the people's lives and accomplishments and failures, in context.
Mhm.
Because if you don't know I didn't want to go so crazy with it that that was going to be a history book of the 1920s through
Mhm.
40s or whatever, And the book goes to the present day. It doesn't end in the 40s, but but I thought that to understand that, and look, part of my reason for becoming a historian and author of books and biographer is really because those, that's the background of many of the comic creators is my background. My parents, aunts, uncles were first generation American born children of Eastern European Jewish immigrants, just like Kirby and Stan and not Ditko. Ditko's from a little different background, although he also Eastern European. But I mean, so to me, and that was, I do a lot with the Will Eisner Foundation and studios. I run something called Will Eisner Week for them, and that's even without knowing it, I think when I was a kid reading the comics, certainly when I got a sense of history and context, and I mean, I'm a native New Yorker like these guys. There's just so much of it that I find, and yet the difference is, of course, that unlike most people's relatives, instead of doing something sensible like becoming doctors or lawyers or accountants or businessmen or women, these people, for whatever strange and complicated series of reasons, created the Fantastic Four. I mean, so created the Spirit, invented the modern graphic novel. So I find that I mean, ultimately, what biography is a very odd thing. I mean, you write a biography, you end up hanging around with biographers and thinking about what is about. A biography is as much what it's not as it is. Right. I spent like a whole book, and any biographer spends a whole book building this construct, trying to kind of, you almost outline the entire life and career and world. The only thing you can't explain in a biography is why that person, if that person had the same background as 10 other people who grew up in the same building, why did this guy invent the Fantastic Four? Or why did these guys invent the Fantastic Four and not the people in apartment 5B? Why did the people in 5A?
Right.
And you can't answer that. The answer is there's some kind of inborn innate talent. All you can do is sort of describe the circumstances and how people reacted to them and how they reacted to people and where it falls into historical context. So biography is this very mysterious, like when you're writing fiction, you are the character. So you kind of, you're controlling the whole puppet show. When you're writing biography, you're constructing this kind of, you're putting together a building or whatever metaphor you want to use, that the only thing you can't answer is how did they do that?
Right.
And it doesn't matter. I mean, I've read 1,000 biographies now because I want to steal from the best, and that's ultimately the answer. It's like you can't answer it. It's just, but it's sort of so it's kind of, how are these people like me and how are they different from me? I guess is why we're interested in other people at all. And so, but that's sort of what led me to write this this book in the first place.
I think you can tell when you read it that there's, it's an old phrase, but a labor of love to it that I think you really enjoyed finding these little parts and pieces and putting it together. And I think it shows when you read the book. It's
Well, thank you.
read.
And again, going back to what you said before, which I really appreciated, most reviewers and most people reading it definitely say what you said, that it seems even-handed, and that I lay, there's a lot of stuff in the book that does not make Stan look good,
Right.
but I try not to put my thumb on the scale. I say, here's what happened, draw your own conclusion.
Exactly.
And it's interesting. I mean, I don't think he had, he obviously had an ego, and he had his, one thing I'm proud of in the interviews I did with him, I managed to get a little bit behind the facade. I figured there was no point in saying to him, "Oh, what about Jack?" What was I going to do? But I sort of was able to get insights into his life and things he'd done and people he knew. But I really, I'm making some point that I've totally lost. But I mean, what was tell me your question? Maybe I'll remember the point that
I was just saying how it was, this is a labor of love that you were, I could tell you were excited putting this together.
Thank you. And look, I think because Stan was in the business virtually from the beginning of the superhero fad anyway, and really, there's 100 different theories about when the first comic book, but if you think of, say, 1933, when Max Gaines famously folded the Sunday page, you take that as an arbitrary beginning. Well, all right, so Stan comes in 1940. It's pretty damn near the beginning. So that, I got to kind of stealth write a history of the comic book business, and in a certain way of, the world of New York, in the 40s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and so on, through the life of Stan Lee.
That's pretty awesome. And how does it feel, knowing that you are now also part of Marvel history? Like, you made your imprint on it. You characters you did, stories you did. It's part of the history now, and you are part of it.
It's cool. I mean, it's a very odd feeling. Look, continuities. Modern Marvel has been around for 60 years. If you go back to the Marvel Comics #1, it's been around over 80 years. So there's a lot of stories that get forgotten, neglected, overlooked. But somewhere it's this funny feeling of knowing that of this entire edifice of Marvel, I hope, that I've contributed something halfway decent. But I mean, it's also funny to think there may be some story that I wrote, just like to pay my rent that month, that I wrote overnight, dousing my head with water from the shower, probably like the worst thing I ever wrote, that somebody grew up loving, right? And is going to want to put in a movie or want to do something. I mean, it's a very, and you just never know this because there's so much Marvel continuity. And there's that old saying, the golden age of anything is 12, right? I mean, that's, so if there's some story that I wrote that maybe wasn't the best thing I ever wrote, but somebody read it when they were 12 and they loved it, it's just funny that, that it's now part of this. On the other hand, there are things I've written I'm very proud of that I labored over and thought were brilliant that nobody's ever mentioned,
So I wanted to ask, before, we don't want to be mindful of your time, but what's next for you? What can we look forward to?
I have of course, the Darkhawk story is out now, the Heart of the Hawk, and that just came out a couple weeks ago. I am trying to move myself more into the pop culture / history biographer world.
Okay.
So my agent is both in graphic novels and in prose. So I have the life story of Jack Ruby.
Really?
the guy who killed Lee Harvey Oswald,
Yeah.
another name, who had one of the strangest, most, one of my taglines for the book is killing Lee Harvey Oswald was not the strangest thing Jack Ruby ever did. I mean, the guy had this astonishing, bizarre life that people have written about, but not for a long time. And oddly, and he turns up all the time. He turned up in the Umbrella Academy this past summer. There was a Jack Ruby character in a number of episodes.
Yeah.
So he's a character. So he's somebody. He's an oddball Jewish American character. An interesting. So I've got in circulation both a graphic novel and a prose biography of him. They're two separate projects. Feel free to contact me, and I can put you in touch with my agent about these. And also, as a Bob Dylan fanatic, I've also got a proposal for I know there's 1,000 books on Bob Dylan. On the other hand, I think I have a fairly unique take on him. So I've also worked up a Bob Dylan-oriented book. And there's a bunch of other things that I'm not at liberty to talk about at the moment.
Yeah, no worries. No, I understand.
When you least expect it, I'll be there.
Boom, another one.
And of course, I've been involved for the past 10 years or more with the Will and Ann Eisner Foundation and Will Eisner Studios, helping them promote something called Will Eisner Week, which is a series of events all over the world. This year, because of the COVID, we did a lot of pre-recorded incredible stuff, interviews with people like Todd McFarlane and Jerry Kraft and Gene Yang and Dennis Kitchen and Paul Levitz that are up at willeisner.com. So, even though Will Eisner was back in March, this stuff is archived. I encourage people, and a great How to Draw the Spirit, Batman and Wonder Woman by Dan Schicade, who's a wonderful young artist. Who did the Spirit maxi series for Dynamite a few years ago, and so I'm always involved with a dozen different things. But check out willeisner.com for that stuff. Best way to get a hold of me or see what I'm doing. Oh, I'm doing now. You got me going.
You're doing this.
I'm doing this. This is the most important thing. This is a life-defining event.
At least for the past 40 minutes or so,
I'm doing a lot of stuff with a site called comixplex.com, comixplex.com.
Okay.
Just this past 2 weekends, I taught a comics editing workshop that people who took it. Now the people who took it have a leg up on you, everybody else who wants to be an editor out there. And J.M. DeMattis teaches a regular comics writing workshop called Imagination 101. And I'll be doing probably one of these things. I'll be doing a video podcast for them, so I can have you guys on. And so like I said, I'm in the classic freelancer mode of doing 100 different things, and I never know when stuff I've done is coming out. But check out all that stuff. And I'll just redundantly say, this book is out. It's in paperback. It's in hardcover, and I read the audiobook. So if you get the audiobook, if you enjoyed this past hour, if this is your idea of a good time, imagine 14 hours of me reading the book to you. Now how much would you pay?
I'm going to recut this to open with that.
Yeah. I'll mail you a blank check.
Okay, thanks.
So also check out DanielFingeroth.com.
Danny Fingeroth.com.
Danny Fingeroth. I'm sorry.
No, I know. It said, I should have changed my name when we came in the room. DannyFingeroth.com and Facebook and Twitter are probably my main social media. My website, I hate to admit it needs to be updated, but you can still send me Danny at DannyFingeroth.com. Send me email.
So that was our interview with Danny Fingeroth. Pretty damn interesting, wasn't it? I mean, he got to spend a fair amount of time with Stan the Man Lee. I mean, he really got to know him, really got to, really know everything about the man and, write an amazing book on it.
Yeah, it's a great book. And like Mike said earlier, he's someone who is a true historian of comic books. You could tell his passion for comics, and a real credit to Marvel with the work he's done.
And if you like this interview, we have plenty more on our podcast channel. Go to look for Dollar Bin Bandits on wherever you get podcasts. So that's Apple, that's Spotify, that's Amazon, that's basically anywhere you can find podcasts. We're also on YouTube. You may be watching us right now. So if you are, continue to watch us. If not, look for Dollar Bin Bandits. We are on social, Dollar Bin Bandits at Dollar Bin Bandits for Facebook, for Instagram, and at DB Bandits for Twitter. So rate, review, subscribe. Please help us get the word out. Tell your friends, tell your enemies, tell your frenemies. Dollar Bin Bandits. We will continue on. It's good to see you. Thank you, Danny Fingeroth. Thank you, fellow bandits.